Okay. The Rabbi.
Okay, we begin as usual with our summary of what's going on. Quite an eventful episode this particular Shabbos. So let's go through the summary of the actual storyline, and then we'll pick up on some of the ideas that we can learn from it. So Isaac and Rebecca are struggling to have children. They pray, and after 22 years of marriage, Rebecca falls pregnant. Very difficult pregnancy. She is struggling with it. She goes to ask the advice of Hashem to the greats of her generation. And they said that in fact she's carrying twins. And there are two nations that will emerge from her womb. And we know they're going to be Jacob and Esau. It's going to be our theme tonight, the diverse journeys of these two children. And they were struggling in her womb, as we'll stop at the Midrash soon to describe what was happening. But she was at least placated that she knew that the struggle in her womb was coming from these two children who were adversities for the rest of their lives. She gives birth to two boys, very different physically. The one is hairy, ruddy. He's like almost like a grown man, as the way he looked as a child. And they called him Esau. Esau in Hebrew comes from the word asa, or ready-made. So he was the ready-made kid. He was almost like an adult when he was born. And the second son was much more timid, and he was born clutching the heel of his brother Esau. And Yaakov means a heel. Comes from the root word is akev, which means a heel. So he was named after the fact that he held onto his brother, his twin brother's heel, coming second, and he was called Jacob. Esau now continues his journey, very different to Yaakov. He becomes a hunter. Jacob is very happy reading books. He is sitting inside, learning and studying and loving Torah. Two different types of children, two different directions. And strangely, Isaac actually favors Esau. He looks to Esau and sees that there's potential, as we'll soon discuss. But Rebecca, Rivka, she prefers Jacob. I'm just going to go out and mute everybody so that we can not be interrupted. So please forgive me. I'm going to mute you. If anyone wants to say anything, unmute yourself. And then we'll be able to hear each other. Let's mute all. Okay. So going back to the summary, Esau now has grown up. He's a hunter. As we said, Isaac favored Esau and Rebecca favored Yaakov. Esau comes home and he's got a ferocious hunger. He's just come from the field, spent the whole day hunting, and he sees his younger brother Jacob standing over the stew that he was cooking, and he says, "Please give me from this pottage that you are cooking." And Yaakov said, "I agree, just a condition that I want you to sell me your birthright, which you have as the fact that you came into the world first. I want you to sell it to me in exchange for the food that I'm going to give you." And Esau says the words, "Lama ze li b'chara." What do I need this firstborn status for? It actually only has reference and importance in terms of Torah, and that's not the direction I'm going. And he says, "Fine, it's worthwhile. I'll give you my birthright, and you give me some food," which is what happens. This is the beginning of a difficult relationship between them. Now Isaac has to escape the famine of Canaan. He travels to Egypt via Plishtim, the Philistines, probably somewhere in the Gaza area. Hashem told him to remain in Plishtim, There's nothing to do with Palestine today, which is a name the Romans gave to the region, maybe because of this biblical standing, but there's no connection in terms of people between the modern day Palestinians and the Plishtim, who preceded the Jewish people to the land. So you might say that the Palestinians have a right because they connected to the Plishtim, but as I've already mentioned once before, the genealogy is such that the Plishtim, the Philistines, they came from Noah's son, who was Shem, was Ham, the one who was cursed actually. Whereas Abraham came from Shem. that's why we called Semites. Semites from Shem, from the son of Noah, who was Shem. So if the Palestinians say that they are connected to the Plishtim people, they would be giving up on the heritage of being children of Abraham. They can't have it both. Abraham had nothing to do with Plishtim, and therefore, if they claim, as they do in their religion, that they are descendants of Abraham, they are not descendants of the Plishtim. Anyway, Hashem tells Isaac to remain over there, and he would receive a lot of blessings, all the blessings that Hashem had promised to Abraham. When the Plishtim inquired regarding his wife, somehow these monarchs liked a pretty woman that came past their country. So Isaac told them that he was actually her sister. She was his sister, of wanting to avoid, as Abraham before, having the husband knocked off so that they can take his wife. It was a ploy to stay alive. And Abimelech, the king of Plishtim, eventually notices that it's not a sister, it's a wife. And he reprimands Isaac and he says, look what you almost brought such tragedy onto my people. How could you tell me that she was a sister? That was the biggest crime, not the fact that he captures a woman against her will. That wasn't the crime. The crime was that Isaac had not clearly said that she was his wife. Isaac gets wealthy, much wealthier. He sows crops. He miraculously harvests 100 times more than what would be the yield of the field. So he becomes a very wealthy man. Then we have a whole interlude about digging wells, which I want to come back to. Why was that significant? And in the same way as we're going to talk about the two personalities of Esau and Jacob, Esau and Yaakov, we're also going to contrast and compare the personalities of Abraham and Isaac. But one of the details is going to be this concept of digging wells. The envious Plishtim see that Isaac has got a lot of wealth, and they say, get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. And they tell him to leave the country. Then there was contested ownership over the wells, which Isaac dug. Quite seemingly extraneous information to the storyline, but we see the difficulties that Isaac had with the Plishtim. Then Hashem appears to Isaac and he blesses him and he says that I will always be with you. And Abimelech and Isaac enter into a peace treaty, and Isaac's servants dig another well. So again, we have the theme of digging wells. Now at the age of 40, Esau marries 2 wives. They serve idols. It's a source of anguish to Isaac and to Rebekah that their son Esau is marrying women and getting completely involved with idolatry. Isaac is now blind. This is quite important detail because he is about to give the blessings to his sons. The information that he's blind is very important to the storyline, as we'll soon see. So he tells Esau, go out and hunt for me my meal. Go get me food, and once you've brought me food, then I will bless you, Esau. Rebekah hears this whole story. She advises Jacob to put on Esau's clothing, to dress up like Esau, to trick Isaac, so that he gets the blessing instead of Esau. She prepares the meal. This was not going to have to be a hunt. It wasn't going to take a long time. She prepares a meal and she gives it to Jacob, puts hairy goat skin over his hands so that he would seem and feel like as if he was Esau, his brother. And he goes into his father who's blind, so he cannot actually see who's in front of him. So Jacob presents himself to Esau as Esau to Isaac. So he pretends that he's Esau. And Isaac eats that from all of the food that Rebekah had prepared. And he blesses him. And he says, Mitala shamayim mishmanei haaretz, from the dew of the heaven and from the fat of the earth, you're going to have it all. And he gives him all of these spiritual and physical blessings. To his son, Yaakov, to Jacob, thinking that he's giving it to Esau. And then suddenly what happens is Esau arrives back from the field and he's informed by his father, who now understood that what had transpired. He'd actually given the blessing to the younger brother, and then actually adds the words, Gam Baruch Yihiyeh, let him in fact be blessed. So he endorses the blessing at this point. He'd given it in error to Jacob rather than as he intended to give it to Esau. But once he sees what has transpired, Now suddenly he endorses it. What happened? Let's try and revisit that as well. What made him suddenly think that now it was a good idea that it went to Jacob, who was the younger brother, whereas previously he intended to give it to Esau? Esau was furious. And Isaac comforted him. He says, I've got a bracha for you too. I'll give you a blessing as well. Esau is not placated. He wants to kill his brother Jacob. Brothers don't get on so well in biblical times, at least in the unfolding stories of Breshit. Rebekah asks Isaac to send Jacob to Haran to find a wife and to get him away from the arrows and from the attempt at his murder by the brother Esau. Isaac does so. He blesses Jacob again. He sends him to his brother-in-law, to Lavan's home, exactly where Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, had gone previously to find a wife for Isaac, back to the same home to find a daughter, a wife for Jacob, his son. And right at the end of the Sedra, we read again that Esau gets married another time to Machalat, the daughter of Yishmael. So there was a connection in the family. So that he also stayed connected to the family. So that's in a nutshell all the events that unfold in this week's Parsha. Quite eventful, and there's a lot of things that need to be understood, particularly this whole story of the blessings, and that the blessings depended on food, no less. That was what's going to make Isaac give the blessing to his son. And then the whole trickery of Jacob with his mother in cahoots and extracting the blessing against what was the intention of the father. This all seems very, very strange, and yet the Torah is telling us all of these facts. So we're going to go on a journey trying to understand some of the details. So let's go through some of the messages that we can take from this week's Parsha. The first thing we're going to talk about is the fact that in the very first verse, it tells us that Isaac was the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. Now the verse never spends extra words telling us what we already know. So why would it say, Eile Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham? These are the generations of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Avraham holidet Yitzchak, Abraham fathered Isaac. Well, if Isaac was the son of Abraham, then we would know that Abraham fathered him, and therefore the Midrash, which Rashi quotes, looks to try and understand why does it refer to the relationship both ways. He was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the son and Jacob was the son of Isaac. So the first thing he says is that, remember, there was a miraculous event that Abraham had a son at a very, very old age. And Rashi says, all of those who were cynical and mocking and scoffing, saying, come on, there's no way that Abraham had a child at that age. It probably was from another man, maybe even from another mother, but Abraham could not have been the father. So Hashem miraculously caused Isaac to be an identical replica of his father. So everybody could look at the son Isaac and say, look, he carries the genes of his father. It's obviously his physical, biological son. That's the first explanation. Then the Midrash says, quoted by Rashi too, that Isaac prided himself that he was Isaac, the son of Abraham, and Abraham prided himself that Abraham fathered Isaac. So let's stop to talk about relationship between parents and children. So what we're saying over here, it's not just telling us that Abraham was the father of Isaac and Isaac was the son of Abraham. It's telling us more, says the Midrash, that there was a relationship in which they prided themselves in each other. Now, very often in generations, parents pride themselves in children, particularly when they're young. Then parents are very, very infatuated by their children and they pride themselves. But sometimes, unfortunately, it's not a reciprocal two-way pride. The parents pride themselves in the children, and the children separate themselves. They talk about the old man. They talk about their parents as irrelevant burdens on their lives because they've moved on to other things. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes both generations don't really care to be associated. Parents who want to wash their hands of their children because they've gotten so many gray hairs and so many frustrations from children and not behaving well. So the parents don't pride themselves in children, and the children certainly don't pride themselves in being the offspring of their parents, because they've moved on. They represent the old generation, and we've moved on to new things. So what it's saying is that in a relationship between Abraham and Isaac, they were very different people, as we'll soon see in the explanations on the portion. Very different personalities, but yet they looked alike. That's the first explanation. They had a physical appearance that they looked like one another. And what does that symbolize? That even though children might have very different personalities to ourselves, there was something very much alike. I'm saying beyond the obvious words of Rashi is that there was a common moral value system that existed both by Abraham and by Isaac. We'll soon see how different they were in personalities, how they differed in the emphasis of what their aspirations were in life and how they would fulfill them. But their moral compass and their religious fervor and connectedness was one and the same. And in that sense, they looked alike. Diverse, different in their personalities, very, very alike in their goals and what they wanted to achieve in the world. And that is why each of them prided themselves in each other. Abraham said, magnificent, this is my son. I have so much nachas. Look at my son. I feel so blessed to have a son like this. And the son looked at Abraham and said, wow, I'm everything I am because of my father. Sometimes when you talk to a Yid who's like found himself a little bit distant from his being connected to his Judaism, he still points to the picture hanging on the wall and he says, that was my great-grandfather. He was a great rabbi in Lithuania. And there is a pride of being connected. But somehow, I think if we would interview the Zayda, which is hard to do because he's a picture on the wall, but if you could interview the Zayda and say, well, what do you think about your grandson? And he might have a heart attack, seeing that his son has become so dislodged from all the things that he thought was important. He doesn't actually feel so good about his son. So it is a remarkable relationship when father and child can be so different in personality, and we'll trace differences, but yet so alike in their goals and their religious commitment, their moral standards, and so alike in that they cared to pride themselves in one another. Sorry, takes a bit longer than I would want it. Then we said that the pregnancy was a difficult pregnancy, and the Midrash fleshes out why was it such a difficult pregnancy. There was like a turmoil going on in her womb, kicking and struggling and moving. She could not hold this pregnancy. And the Midrash says that whenever she would pass by a house of prayer or a house of study, Jacob would struggle to come out. This was his moment. Oh, this is where I want to be. This is before they were even born into the world. When she passed by a house of idolatry, Esau would struggle. And he said, this is my place. This is where I want to be. And also they were struggling between themselves, fighting over the inheritance of the worlds. Two worlds. Material world and the worlds to come. So the Midrash is saying that the fight and the hatred, that the enmity that existed between Esau and Jacob was actually there even before they were born into the world. And for some reason, Rebecca's comforted. Well, the reason is that if she had only one child in her womb, can you imagine? And then she was dealing with the fact that whenever she went past the shul, the child wants to come out. Then she goes past idolatry, the child wants to come out. So now she thinks she's got a schizophrenic child who doesn't know what he wants. He's all over the place. He wants to be here and he wants to be there. So when she found out that in fact it was two children, she was carrying twins. So as difficult as it was to know that there was enmity between the children, even before they were born, at least she realized that it was not a schizophrenic one child who didn't know which direction was going to go in, but in actual fact, two children with two different destinies and two different struggles in the world that they were going to enter into. So Rashi also says, and this is going to become a theme of the conflict between Esau and Jacob. The Gemara says, Esau soina leYaakov. Esau hates Jacob. It's halacha. In fact, we take it as a given. This is a fact of life, that there is hatred, there's going to be anti-Semitism, even though it was at that stage his brother, but it would be the father of all of those things would have conflict and fight with what it is the Jew wants to achieve in this world. And Rashi says, mil'om mil'om yemotz means that they'll never be equal. As the one goes up, the other goes down. When the one rises, the other falls. They actually cannot be contained in the same world alongside one another. So what this means is that if we try and make this practical, that there's a spiritual world and there's a physical world. There are spiritual pursuits and there are physical pursuits. And if one is aligned and aspiring to spiritual goals, the physical needs in this world become much less important. And if the physical world is the total focus, we wake up in the morning and it's all about making money and it's all about assets and all the physical things in this world, the spiritual dimension automatically gets weakened. It's a seesaw because there are two different needs inside of us. And the question is, who's boss? Who's in charge? And in the holy book of Tanya, the analogy that he gives is like two kings fighting over the same city. If we're to use the conflict between Esau and Jacob as the conflict between two different directions, two different worlds, and they actually take place inside of ourselves. We ourselves have within us the voice of Jacob, the hands of Esau that we're going to hear about, and there is the conflict. And the way the Tanya gives the metaphor to understand the conflict, he says there are two kings trying to take over the same city. I mean, like happened in Europe, like in the Second World War, or even prior to the Second World War, you had borders that constantly were moving. In fact, if you asked people from my father's generation which country they came from, it always depended, well, Svensak, before the war it was Poland, and after the war it was Lithuania, and then it was Russia. The borders kept moving. So the Sefer Tanya says, this is all an analogy of two different kings trying to master the same city. And when the one king overwhelms the other, so when he moves in, he changes the road signs. Now the road signs are in Polish. And everything about the city takes on the characteristics and the architecture, and everything about the city takes on the atmosphere and the ethos and the direction of Poland. The next week, Germany moves in. They change the road signs to German, and they emphasize different parts of the city, and everything, the character of the city starts changing and turning. So says the Tanya, are the two kings trying to battle over our being. We have a Yetzer Tov, which is a godly soul, and we have an animal soul. And these two souls are fighting for the city. The city is us. And sometimes the one king is the king who's the Nefesh Habamit, the animal soul. And when it takes over, it changes all the road signs. It says life is about money and life is about wealth and honor and glory. And it changes everything around us as to be what the focus and priorities and what the directions are in our life. And a moment later or a day later, the godly soul moves in and takes over. The difference is that in a human being, it might happen, flip back and forth a few times in the same day, in the same hour. And each time the one king takes over and stakes his claim. And in that moment, the other becomes less important, like the seesaw of Esau and Jacob. When the physical element becomes more the focus, the spiritual desire becomes weakened. And when the spiritual focus becomes completely involved, then the physical needs become less. It's the Jew on Yom Kippur and the Jew who's unfortunately caught up in a moment of distraction by his Yetzer Hara. So this conflict traces it back to biblical characters, but we can certainly use their personality and what they stood for as a model to understand ourselves and to understand the inner conflicts that are taking place in our own lives. Moving on. So the verse tells us that Isaac loved Esau, kitzayid befiv, because he had game or venison or the hunt in his mouth. He was a hunter. That's why he liked him. But the Midrash says that there was game, there was hunting in his mouth. So the Midrash says that he was very deceptive, that Esau had a way of presenting himself as holier than he really was. As the Midrash Tanchuma quoted by Rashi says, Esau would deceive him with his mouth. Kitzayid befib. He was a hunter with his mouth. The words became important. He'd inquire of his father, Father, how do you take tithe? How do you take Maisa, the responsibility to give a tenth of wealth to tzedakah? How do we apply it to salt? Now, the tithe only applies to that which grows from the ground, so it doesn't apply to salt. But it made him look like he was trying to ask a very, very subtle shaila, asking his father, how do I take tithe from salt? Something that you didn't need to take tithe from, but it really looked like he was very pious. So he presented himself as a very pious son. Father, how does one take the tithe from straw? Now, straw is not normally eaten by human beings, and the tithe that had to be given from the produce of the farmer only applied to that which grew from the ground, which excluded salt, and it only applied to that which was for the consumption of human beings, not straw. So Esau came to his father, Isaac, and said, how do you take the tithe from those items that you in fact didn't have to take the tithe from, but pretending that he was so religious and wanting to give tzedakah with such a passion? And Isaac would muse, this son of mine, how diligent he is in the fulfillment of the commandment. It's quoted in the Midrash. So I want to talk about salt and straw as themes. So we've spoken about the attempt of Esau to deceive his father by pretending that he wanted to take the tithe from these two items. Let's just think of these items in terms of themes. So when we think of salt, salt represents very, very precious spiritual values. The Torah is often compared to salt, and covenants that were made were called salt treaties long before the modern day salt treaties. They were called bris melach, the covenant of salt. Salt was a very important feature, which is it also is at our tables when we sit down to eat. Salt was at every sacrifice in the temple. What are the qualities of salt? So salt, the commentaries tell us, have three main characteristics. Firstly, they help prepare the food. When you have meat that you want to eat as a Jew, you need salt to extract the blood from the meat. Nowadays, we buy it from the butchery, so we don't even know that this is happening behind the scenes. But as a child, I remember watching my parents salt the meat. They actually bought it, and we did it at home. And chickens, yeah. So the salt is able to extract the blood and prepare the food for better consumption. The second thing that salt does is that it adds taste. We put salt in food so that we spice the food and it adds taste. The third thing salt does is that it preserves. In days before refrigeration, they would salt the meat such that the meat would then not go bad. So all of these represent the Torah, because the Torah is able to preserve. It turns a finite moment into an infinite opportunity. The Torah is able to prepare life and extract the dross from that which is important. And Torah adds taste to life. It gives life additional meaning. Torah is compared to salt. On the total opposite end of the spectrum in life is straw. Straw is fodder for the animal. So on either side of the spectrum, there's the holies that doesn't need to be tithed, and there is the animal fodder which is not worthy of being tithed. Two opposite ends of the spectrum. So Esau comes along and he says, I want to try and adjust things in my world. Maybe I can take that which is fit for the animal fodder, and if I give the tithe and I give a bit of tzedakah, I can legitimize the animal. This is the approach in life, to say that we can turn that which is inappropriate and that which is sinful into being acceptable because we're giving tzedakah. And suddenly, because we're giving tzedakah from stolen money or from ill-earned money, we suddenly become holy. So the answer to that, to Esau, is no. You cannot transform that which is animal-like into being acceptable because you've given the tithe. The tithe applies to the things that are legitimate and appropriate. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have so many attempts at adjusting the religious connection to Hashem. We could reform things, we could change things, we could take ownership of it and do to the Torah, top end, as we as human beings feel fit. So the inner message of this idea of taking tithe from the straw and taking tithe from the salt was those who wish to tamper with God's plan in this world. Those, sometimes it's ourselves and sometimes in different modes in our same lifetime. Sometimes we think that if we can only give to tzedakah from that which is inappropriate, we legitimize. And the answer to that is no. And sometimes we think that if we get involved in readjusting God's structure for the world, we can perfect it even more. And the answer is no. Don't tithe the Torah and don't tithe the animal. It only works in the arena in which Hashem has given us to try and utilize this world for a better purpose, not to the animal and not to the salt. Moving on with the theme of this Shabbos. So this is just incidental, so we'll go through it quickly. What was Jacob cooking? And it's important to know that he was cooking lentils. And the Midrash, actually quoted in the Gemara, says it was that on that day that Abraham had died, Jacob made a broth of lentils to comfort his father Isaac. That's why he was cooking. That's why it was actually important to tell us that he was cooking and what he was cooking. He was cooking lentils. Why lentils? Just as a lentil has no edge, meaning no mouth, so is the mourner speechless. And just as the lentil is round, so mourning comes around to all inhabitants of this world, and we have the image of the cycle. So I thought it important just to share this midrash, because one of the customs today, when God forbid one is going through loss, immediately after the mourners return from the funeral, the custom is for family members or extended friends to bring to the home bagels and eggs. And all of this custom traces itself back to this event in this Shabbos Azrini. Because Abraham had passed away, Jacob was cooking. He wanted to comfort his father. What was he cooking? Lentils. Lentils are round. The Midrash, the Gemara quotes Midrash that has two different elements in round, the lentils. Firstly, it has no edge, no mouth, just as a mourner loses the voice and the desire to be involved in conversation. Much more silent, but more importantly that it's the cycles of life. Life is not a number, a ruler. It's not a number line. It doesn't start at a certain point and end at a certain point, and that's it. It's a circle, because life is going through constant cyclic movement. Before life, our souls live through this world, and then beyond this world, they're all cycles. And in life itself, there are constant cycles. So what we comfort the mourner, we say to the mourner, it's not the end. This is not the final chapter. This is part of a cycle. And as hard as it is to bear the loss, just know that life will continue and life is constantly a cycle. We don't end off with bad. In fact, the Jew always lives with optimism, because even when we're at the bottom and the very bottom, we always have the hope of a better tomorrow. So we talk about cycles, and it all traces itself back to this event that unfolded with Jacob cooking lentils on the day that he lost his father. I want to talk just a few minutes about the fact that Isaac gets a unique instruction that his father Abraham never got. Hashem says to him, God appears to him, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in this land. And Hashem says to him, why should Isaac not go down to Egypt? Remember when Abraham came to the promised land and there was a famine, Hashem says, go down to Egypt, and accepts the fact that Abraham did so. Here, Hashem is saying, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land. So why would there be such a difference? So God said to him, you are a burnt offering without blemish. You are like a korban brought in the temple in Jerusalem. Just as a burnt offering becomes unfit if it passes beyond the temple enclosures, so you will become unfit if you go out of the Holy Land. Isaac never left Israel. Abraham came from out of Israel, went into Israel, journeyed to Egypt, then journeyed back again. Isaac never left. So we're going to talk about two different roles, the role of Isaac and the role of Abraham, as themes that are important, and time is running out on me, so I'm going to have to say it very quickly because I want to get to the gist of what we wanted to speak about. And that is that in every relationship, there is a need for love, which is an attraction, a drawing close, and there's also a need for boundaries and respect between parents and children, even between husband and wife. There is the love that draws husband and wife to cleave to one another, and there is the respect that needs to be intact, even in a relationship of husband and wife, for sure, of being able to respect time and place and personality as they are different. And Abraham represented the theme of embracing, of loving, of reaching out, of affecting the whole world. That's why he was mobile. That's why he had to leave Israel too, because he affected the environment way beyond. His whole idea was to reach out. Isaac, by stark contrast, was like the korban, like the sacrifice, who was so set aside for holiness that he represented the boundaries, the discipline, the containment, the commitment to the inner core. They were totally different personalities. Jacob eventually was the ability to synthesize both, and that's why he was the third dimension, Tiferet, which was able to bring both the strengths of Abraham and Isaac together. But as two personalities, Abraham and Isaac were vastly different in their approach. And I'll just touch on the wells, and then I want to move on to the main theme, because with the wells, you have a difference in the way that Abraham served water and the way Isaac served water. Abraham served water by bringing water to the person who was hungry, thirsty. We see that with the three Arabs that are coming past his home. He brings them water. Isaac says life is not about giving water. Life is about teaching how to dig a well. And in our relationships with our children and our students, there are different ways. We could spoil our children by showering them with all the kindness and the chesed, and there are moments that we need to do that. But there are also Isaac moments, which is to say to the child, you have to find the answer. I want to give you the ability to go through the challenge and to realize it yourself. It's up to you to develop yourself from within. That's the concept of the well that was constantly being dug by Isaac again and again, and the names of the wells. The theme of well, it becomes so important because it is in contrast to the approach of Avraham, which was to shower people with kindness. Isaac was teaching the discipline of learning how to do it yourself, which ultimately helps the person much more. And Jacob synthesized both of those themes. But I now go into the main story that we wanted to talk about. Whoops, sorry. Okay, I have to skip. I want to talk about this whole discussion between Rebekah and Isaac. So what we have to understand is, why would Isaac think it important to ask his son to go and hunt and thereby merit getting these supposedly spiritual blessings, the future of his progeny? Why did it depend on food? And how could Rebekah deceive her husband? Why didn't Rebekah tell her husband this is the wrong thing to do? She should have gone over to her husband and said, you're giving the blessing to the wrong son, and these are the reasons, and convince him. But to trick her husband? And furthermore, why, when Isaac becomes aware of what has happened, he endorses the blessing and says, Gam Baruch Yiyeh, in fact, you're right, my wife. As most husbands should say at times in their life, and probably very often, you're right, my wife. Because most times they're right. So Isaac agreed that Rebekah was correct. So we must say that there was actually a relationship between Isaac and Rebekah, which was one of trust and one of discussing and sharing and talking to one another. And they spoke about this very often. There was a different worldview and different approach of Isaac and Rebekah. They both knew their sons and the differences between their sons. Let's not think that Isaac was fooled for all of his life to think that his son Esau was the good guy deserving of the blessings. But this is what is at the foundation of the discussion that probably took place in their dining rooms every night over supper. Isaac said, I need to have a progeny that is going to survive. I needed children that are going to be able to endure. I know that Jacob is the one that's connected to Torah, but he's going to be pushed around. He's not going to have the ability to withstand a world that is going to be so harsh. I need to find a way of getting through to Esau that he can use all of his physical strength and his power and his ability to hunt, that he can use it for a good cause. I need to find a way to do that. And Rebekah kept saying, no, my dear husband, we're not going to find the nachas in Esau by finding a way of him directing his negative traits to good. The answer lies in the opposite. Let's find a way of enthusing Jacob, who seems so timid and so connected to Torah. He's got the real values. If we worry that he's not going to survive generations of anti-Semitism and he's going to be pushed around, let's find a way to get the strength of Jacob to survive all of these troubles. That was the discussion, probably happening every night. And then it came to the crux. Why does Isaac send his son to hunt? So that he can get the blessings. He was giving a message to his son Esau. You hunt for sport. You think this world is just a joke. You're using all of your physical strength and your desire to spill blood just for the sport and for the fun of it. Don't you realize what you could achieve if you would use your strength to achieve something that creates growth in the world, that feeds the world, that makes a difference to an old father? You have the capacity to use your wildness, channel it, harness it, use it in the right direction, and you could be worthy of the blessing. I know that I can never change you. You're a hunter. You're a hunter to the core. But direct the hunt to something that can be of benefit to humankind. And the hunt preceding the blessings was a demonstration that the blessings could be earned if he would only use his wildness of his personality for good. And Rebekah, she hears all of this. She has to demonstrate the opposite. You know, my husband, that the true value is in Jacob. He's the one that's learning Torah. He's the one that embodies all the goodness that we desire. But you think that he cannot survive in a world of Esau? He can outsmart Esau in Esau's world. He can live in a world of Esau, and he can win the battle there too. It's easier and better to train the timid child, who might be a pushover, to have the strength, than to transform the hunter into a man of purpose. That was the debate. That was the debate between a father and a mother. She was saying you can take the Jacob and you can put the hands, the hairy skin over his hands, and he can present himself as an Esau to confront the Esau world. It's easier to do that than to gain a value system in a man who lives on treachery and hatred. And in today's world, you have a soldier of the IDF who has to carry a gun and put on a uniform. We've learned how to defend ourselves because we've had to. We've learned what Rebekah was trying to say. If we need to fight a world on its terms, we'll find the way to fight the world on its terms. We'll put on the garments of the military. We'll dress ourselves up as that which needs to defend itself. We can do that. But let the call be the voice, as what happens when Isaac realizes that he's been tricked, and he's trying to understand before he realizes. He says, I don't understand. Hakol kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Jacob. V'hayadayim, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Those are the two possibilities of the children. Esau is the man of the hands that kill and maim and hurt. And Yitzchak was hoping that if he could only give those hands some purpose, that would be the best recipe for the survival of his children. And Rebecca was saying, no, the most important ingredient is the value system, is the voice of Jacob, is the goals that are ethical, that are moral. The inner core has to be there. That's what is the inner core of the progeny of our people. And if we need to, we'll put on the skins of the animal. We'll put on the external dress and act in a world different to how we would naturally want to behave, because that's a survival tactic, and we can use the survival tactic. So according to this, we have a whole storyline over here. Rebecca wasn't tricking her husband against something that she'd never discussed with him. She had spoken to him. There was a demonstration of their two approaches. Isaac demonstrating that if you only give Esau the opportunity to utilize his wild nature and terrible personality for good, you can train him, you can rein him in, you can direct that energy for good. That's what he was trying to demonstrate with a hunt, for food to eat. And Rebecca was saying, no, my husband, let me show you that ultimately Jacob can handle Esau on his terms. He can put on the garment, the external display of acting like the Esau in an Esau world to confront him. That's the easy part. The hard part is what's inside. And that's what we need to. And Isaac, when he sees what's happened, and he sees that Jacob not only can survive Esau, he can actually outsmart Esau in his world. He says, my wife, you're right. The recipe is that the voice has to be the voice of Jacob, and you can put on the external of Esau to survive. Not the other way around. Not that the inner core is rotten, and then you do an act to give it a legitimacy and a purpose. You're not going to have nachas in Esau. And that's when Isaac says, Gam baruch yiyeh, in actual fact, let him be blessed. You're right, my wife. You had the recipe for the true survival of our people. I'm sorry that it's gone a little bit over 8. I'm moving into a meeting, so I'm going to say thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you, Mark, for joining us all the way from Atlanta. Thank you, Basil, all the way in Plet, and everyone in Oaklands and further places. Thank you, Percy, for joining. Thank you, all the names and all the people that I can see in front of me. I'm going to ask you to say goodbye, and please, God, we'll see you again next week. And those who have just joined for the meeting, please stay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rov. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.